introduce the director, the head of the Memphis Centered series here on campus, and a brilliant mind in his own right, Professor Charles Hughes. Thank you.
Thank you so much. It's so wonderful to see all of you here tonight. I don't know about that brilliant bit, but thank you, Dr. McKinney, for that introduction. I just want to very briefly introduce our speaker this evening, who many of you already know, but who we are all privileged to have with us tonight. Dr. Aram Goudsouzian is professor, chair, and faculty advisor for the Graduate Association for African American History over at the University of Memphis. He is primarily interested in American popular culture, African American history, 20th century United States history, and he teaches a variety of courses related to those topics and others. I would read off all of his various publications and accomplishments, but I don't want us to be here for too long. But suffice to say that he has published widely, including several books: The Hurricane of 1938, Sidney Poitier, Man, Actor, Icon, King of the Court, Bill Russell, and the Basketball Revolution, and the new project just released last month, I think, right? This month, all right. Down to the Crossroads, Civil Rights, Black Power, and the Meredith March Against Fear, about which he will be speaking this evening. This book, as perhaps you have seen, has been garnering wide acclaim in a variety of publications and in a variety of avenues, and it is a wonderful opportunity tonight to hear him speak about this exciting new work. So please welcome to Rhodes College our friend and colleague, Dr. Aram Goudsouzian.
Good evening, everybody.
Good evening.
Make sure my clicker's on. It is a great honor and a pleasure to be here on this beautiful campus with so many people here, including so many of my friends. I'm really touched. And thanks to Charles McKinney, my good friend of the program in African American Studies, to the Office of Multicultural Affairs, to the Memphis Center, to Milton Moreland, and to Charles Hughes for that wonderful introduction, to the Rhodes Lecture Board, and to Jonathan Judakin, the Spence L. Wilson Chair in Humanities, who does so much work for the public intellectual life of Memphis. I'm just touched again by all the work they did and for everyone coming here tonight. Let's begin on the late afternoon of June 6, 1966. We're just south of Hernando, Mississippi. James Meredith, this man here, is walking down Highway 51. He's wearing that faded yellow pith helmet. He's twirling an ebony walking stick, which has an ivory tip on it. He's on the second day of a planned trek from Memphis, Tennessee to Jackson, Mississippi, and he's outlined two goals for this march, for this walk, I should say. The first, he says, is to, quote, challenge that all-pervasive fear that dominates the day-to-day life of the Negro in the United States, especially in the South and particularly in Mississippi. Second, he says, is to, quote, encourage the 450,000 unregistered Negroes in Mississippi to go to the polls and register. He's not walking by himself. Rolling alongside him are cars with newspaper reporters, officers from DeSoto County, state highway patrolmen, and FBI agents. Meredith is famous. After all, 4 years earlier, he had spawned a national crisis when he integrated the University of Mississippi, known, as, of course, as Ole Miss. That had led to riots, the deaths of 2 innocent men, injuries of many more, and a political crisis for what was then the Kennedy administration in terms of what was to be the federal government's role in civil rights. But at this point, 4 years later, in June of 1966, this is more or less the endeavor, for all the attention around him, it's still the endeavor of a solitary man. He has 4 companions who start out with him. This is not a mass march. But it is still just sort of gaining momentum. He's just had his first real moment of sort of small triumph. He's passed through the town of Hernando, and about 150 African Americans were there to greet him. And they shook his hand, and they promised that they would go register to vote. And Meredith was particularly proud of the men who had greeted him, because they were defying the culture of fear that they saw, exactly what his goal was. There was a crowd of hostile whites across the town square who were glaring at this show that they saw, and they were furious with the local blacks for participating in it, but they nevertheless did. So Meredith was very buoyed by this moment. So now he's a few miles south of Hernando again, in this stretch right here, and he's passing down this gently dipping stretch of road. It's lined with pine trees, scrub oaks, there's roadside gullies, that are dotted with honeysuckle and some pine seedlings. There's red clay soil, of course, in Mississippi, and it rained that morning, so it smells very earthy, very alive. There's a few cars rolling ahead of him, a few cars rolling behind in this protection. Meredith's flanked by, at that time, 3 of his companions. And they hear a shout, "James Meredith! James Meredith!" There's a man in the gully, a white man. And he raises a shotgun. And at that moment, someone swore that they could see the sunshine glint off the barrel of the shotgun. Bang! James Meredith screamed. Everyone around him was scrambling and tripping over each other. Bang! Second shot. Meredith was crawling across the road. His eyes were white with panic. He was saying, "Who? Who? Who shot?" Bang! Third shot. The white man walked onto the road, had come closer, and fired the shot. And as Meredith screamed, he calmly walked back into the woods. Throughout the shooting, the law enforcement seemed to have been paralyzed, as if they didn't know what to do. All of a sudden, they snapped out of it. Porters were barking questions. Photographers were snapping away. Marchers were screaming for an ambulance. Somebody was suggesting that a priest who was on the march read him his last rites. James Meredith, the hero of the Ole Miss crisis, was lying splayed on the gravel shoulder of Highway 51, blood soaking through the back of his shirt. 3 blasts from a shotgun. They transformed what was one man's walk into a civil rights extravaganza. Over the next 3 weeks, we'd see the titans of black politics descending upon Mississippi. Activists, reporters from around the nation, around the world, would come to Mississippi. This was a march that was full of political experiments, practical alliances, and some very chaotic debates. Most famously, this march is known for spawning the cry of Black Power, which would define the next generation of the Black freedom struggle. Those 3 weeks in June 1966 are the story of Down to the Crossroads. This is a march that's been called both the Meredith March and the March Against Fear. It's full of inspiring moments of black people overcoming their fears, registering to vote, surging with pride, defying the symbols of white supremacy. And it features notable leaders such as Martin Luther King and Stokely Carmichael. But it's a story that I hope I emphasize belongs to many others too, and that's everything from President Lyndon Johnson all the way to poor black sharecroppers in the Mississippi Delta. I see this book as both what I call an old and a new civil rights history. An old history because in many ways it is a familiar story to many historians. It revolves to some degree around Martin Luther King, around nonviolent protest, brutal Southern racists, dramatic media flashpoints, and national legislation that helped to weave black people into the fabric of American democracy. In this old history, so to speak, it's often told as after these great triumphs, it frays apart with the dawn of black power. But there's a new civil rights history as well, but it's really the contributions of a few generations of civil rights scholars. They see the importance of local movements. They see critical roles of grassroots activists, particularly women. They see what they call a long civil rights movement that stretches well beyond the years of Martin Luther King. And they place the movement into an international context. Many of these scholars see black power not as simply destructive, but as an affirmative voice for black identity and for political change. Ultimately, I argue black power and the march itself is both constructive and destructive, both hopeful and cynical, both unifying and alienating. This is a narrative that has many layers, and as luckily for a historian, can be accessed through a huge variety of sources. It generated abundant media coverage at the time. It was in the records of all the civil rights organizations. Many people have since contributed oral histories. They have personal papers. There are memoirs that are both published and unpublished. Moreover, the march was closely monitored by the FBI, by the Mississippi State Highway Patrol, and by a group called the Mississippi State Sovereignty Commission, which was dedicated to preserving segregation in the state of Mississippi. Luckily, I was also able to interview about 100 participants in the march. These included civil rights veterans, leaders from both Memphis and Mississippi, local participants, and people from around the nation, some of whom just came to walk for a day or two. I was once talking to a marcher named Cortland Cox, who had been an organizer for the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, SNCC. And he was telling me about how he'd been very skeptical about his organization's participation in the march, for reasons that I'll talk about later. But he kind of came to accept it. He'd been very active in the March on Washington 3 years earlier, and he said, you know what? He saw sort of the passion that a lot of people were bringing to this endeavor, and he said, everybody should have their march. And I kind of like that phrase, everybody should have their march. It stuck with me. It's an approach I kind of tried to adopt for myself and adapt for myself. As I talked to people and as I discussed these historical figures, I tried to take them on their own terms, to try to understand how they understood the march, what it meant to them, what it meant to their vision for racial equality. Everybody should have their march. I liked it. James Meredith had his march. He in fact survived the attack. He'd been shot with birdshot pellets, but they lodged into his head, into his neck, into his back, into his leg. So he had to recuperate. He spent some time in the hospital and then went back to New York City to recuperate. But once he was shot, it allowed civil rights organizations to continue his path. But it was no longer his march. They were marching in his name. And it wasn't his, and he had somewhat lost control of the march, and this very much frustrated him. In his mind, this was a march that was to be conducted by independent men like him. It was not to involve women and children, and it was not to impose upon the local communities in Mississippi. Through the rest of the march, he continued to express his dissatisfaction with what had happened. While he was still recuperating, he gave a press conference in a hospital in Memphis, and very dramatically collapsed under the hot television lights. Even when he was recuperating in New York City, he gave press conferences in which he expressed his dissatisfaction, his bitterness that the march had taken a detour from his planned route all the way down Highway 51 and had detoured into the Mississippi Delta. And he was frustrated that these civil rights organizations were bickering, that the march lacked order. He was a guy who was a military veteran, and also someone who had a very strong sense of his own personal destiny. He often referred to his own divine responsibility to further racial progress. Moreover, he was a critic of nonviolence. In fact, he regretted, on that second day of the walk, not having a gun. He later was expressed, "He shot me like I was a goddamn rabbit." Meredith, in fact, returned to the march for the final days, but he did it on his own terms. He showed up at a meeting of the major march leaders, but he left in the middle of it. He was so frustrated with what he saw as sort of a chaotic debate going on. And he decided at one point that he was going to lead his own march from one stop to the next, from Canton to Yazoo College near the end of the march. That was somewhat of a moment of triumph for him, in that he garnered a number of followers, and it ended with Martin Luther King meeting him at the gates of Tougaloo and walking through with a huge crowd. And it was James Meredith himself who garnered the biggest cheers at the final rally when they finally did get to Jackson. The shooting and the subsequent march had actually boosted Meredith's standing in pretty significant ways. In some ways, it rescued him from obscurity. Since the Ole Miss crisis, he kind of drifted out of the public eye. He spent some time in Washington, D.C. He did a fellowship in Nigeria, which he later abandoned. He was at the time in Columbia Law School, and he started this walk not just with the goals that he'd outlined, but also to further his own political career. And he hoped that it was going to help sort of gather people to restore his name. To some extent, it did that. After he was shot, there were many media profiles of him. It allowed him to sort of further his own ideology. In some ways, Meredith was interesting because in some ways he was fundamentally conservative. He talked often about manhood, and he talked about respecting the whites of Mississippi, and he used a very different language and a different set of tactics than most of the established civil rights organizations. And he didn't want to be part of any civil rights organization. This was very important to him. Yet others used Meredith's shooting in different ways. For many liberals, they saw this as a great political opportunity. There was a civil rights bill that was then before Congress, the Civil Rights Bill of 1966. And liberals painted this as a great chance to sort of escalate it back into the public eye and to generate momentum for this bill. Just as in the previous year during the Selma demonstrations, it had generated momentum for the Voting Rights Act, which had passed in 1965. Moreover, they painted his shooter, the man in the lower right corner there, Aubrey Norville, a man from here in Memphis. They painted him as a vicious white supremacist, a symbol of the racist barriers that continue. And perhaps he was even working in cahoots with Mississippi authorities. Many people said they cried conspiracy. Yet Aubrey Norville turns out to be one of the march's great mysteries. He was a hardware clerk from Memphis who had no known connection to any white supremacist organization, Ku Klux Klan or otherwise. No apparent motive. No legitimate getaway plan. So why did he do it? We still don't know. He never revealed his motives. He spent a couple of years in prison, plea bargained his way out at the end. And this had an interesting political effect, because it not just allowed liberals and radicals within the civil rights movement to blame Norville, it also allowed segregationists, the white segregationists of Mississippi, to blame Aubrey Norville. They said, and they cried conspiracy on their own. They said, civil rights organizations must have paid this guy to shoot James Meredith, because if they did that, that would lead to this big crisis and lead to a great civil rights march, and everyone would come to Mississippi and blame us. So there was a flip side to this that was very interesting. I said everybody should have their march. Well, the white supremacists had their march too, I guess. Stokely Carmichael had his own march. Born in Trinidad, raised in the Bronx, educated at Howard University. By the early 60s, he was a fearless grassroots organizer, particularly in Mississippi, and particularly during Freedom Summer of 1964. He was a man with a gift for connecting with local people. He was both charismatic and provocative. But he was increasingly disillusioned with the federal government, particularly after in the 1964 Democratic National Convention, when in Mississippi, SNCC had helped to organize what was known as the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party, an independent arm, if you will, of the Democratic Party. And they wanted to seat their delegates at the National Convention. And the National Party only offered them 2 at-large seats while seating the entire white supremacist all-white delegation. This frustrated not just Carmichael, but a whole generation of SNCC and CORE activists. And they came to see the federal government not as their ally, but perhaps as part of the problem, as an enemy. So in 1965, he led a new project in Lowndes County, Alabama, where he spearheaded the creation of an independent all-black party. This was not within the established framework of the Democratic Party, but rather its own organization, the Lowndes County Freedom Organization. This was his prescription for America's racial hypocrisy. This is what he saw should be a vision for the future. Independent black communities with black majorities, whether they're in the rural black belt or in the ghettos of the North. 1 month before the march, he was at a SNCC retreat, and he said in the meeting, "We assumed we could organize around ideals, such as goodness, justice. We assumed that this country is really a democracy, which just isn't working." At that very same meeting, he was elected the new chairman of SNCC. Just 1 month before the march, he became the chairman of SNCC. And in some ways, it signaled SNCC's evolution as an organization. They had issued, by then, an anti-Vietnam War statement. They were the first civil rights organization to do so. They soon boycotted a White House conference on civil rights. Stokely Carmichael was in the media was saying such things as integration is irrelevant. Rather, he was arguing the real purpose of the civil rights movement is to uplift black people. Whether there's integration or not, whether we work with whites or not, is irrelevant. And SNCC increasingly defined itself against these types of nonviolent mass marches that appeal to white consciences, such as Birmingham, such as Selma, sort of the iconic stories of the civil rights past. Nevertheless, Carmichael saw the march as a unique opportunity. They would be going through the Mississippi Delta, where SNCC had a long history of organizing. And he saw this as a chance to sort of promote SNCC's agenda on a national stage. And when he was trying to convince SNCC's Central Committee that they should get involved in the march, he said, quote, "This can get people, quote, relating to the concept of black power." And on June 16, in Greenwood, Mississippi, about halfway through the march, this is the gateway to the Delta, where the march is detoured, again at the Militants' urging, and where SNCC has this legacy of organizing, Carmichael provoked his own arrest. They would try to set up the tents where the marchers stayed at Stone Street Elementary School, an all-black elementary school in Greenwood. The local authorities refused to let them do it, and they arrested Carmichael. So later that day, when most of the marchers arrived in Greenwood, they simply occupied a park in the heart of Greenwood's Black District called Broad Street Park. By that evening, Carmichael had been bailed out of jail, and he was able to join the huge rally that was taking place in Broad Street Park with about 1,000 people. Many of these people knew Carmichael, and they'd been prepped by advanced organizers, by people like Willie Ricks and other SNCC organizers who were promoting this slogan. So when Carmichael, in the midst of the speech, which was delivered on the back of a flatbed truck in the middle of this park, says, "We want black power, we want black power," and he asks, "What do we want?" The people know to respond and do so loudly and in unison, "Black power. What do we want? Black power. What do we want? Black power." It's a slogan that immediately resonates with the people. It captures both frustrations and aspirations of the people. Frustrations because they're frustrated with what they see as a very slow pace of federal reform. Yes, the Voting Rights Act is passed. Yes, the Civil Rights Act is passed, but that hasn't changed life on the ground in Greenwood, Mississippi. They see the limits with nonviolence and these appeals to white consciences. They see among white liberals uncertain commitments, reluctant allies. But I also said that it captures their frustrations about control over their own communities, the aspirations for controlling their own destiny, for taking pride in their blackness. Black power was a simple lingo that helped them do that. Stokely Carmichael would come to be seen by the end of the march as sort of the human embodiment of the slogan of black power. It was a contested term, one that had many meanings, and one that was almost immediately debated and became controversial. For the press, they tended to see black power almost purely in terms of violence, because they were consistently contrasting it to Martin Luther King's ethic of nonviolence. For many of the young militants in the civil rights movement, they saw it in very different ways. They saw it as fundamental to the bigger issue of race consciousness, of liberating themselves, not just politically, but psychologically, from the shackles of white racism. For more blacks, probably, it was just simply a way to assert control, a way to stake your claim to your destiny, a way to express pride in yourself. For the rest of the march, Stokely Carmichael will remain a lightning rod, someone who was adored and admired by many blacks, despite whatever their political orientation, one that provoked anxieties among many liberals, and one who was detested by conservatives as a dangerous radical. So Stokely Carmichael, everybody should have their march. Stokely Carmichael had his own march. Martin Luther King, too, he had his march. King is kind of at the narrative center of this story. I think the Meredith March kind of reveals his greatest gifts even as it's testing him, as he's never really been tested before. There are plenty of reasons for his organization, the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, or SCLC. There were plenty of reasons for them not to get involved. They didn't have much of experience in Mississippi. They hadn't done much organizing there. And SCLC was then in the midst of a very ambitious campaign to try to apply the nonviolent tactics of the Southern Civil Rights Movement to the city of Chicago, a huge northern city, issues of race and class intertwined. But when Meredith is shot, it's King who decides that they have to go to Memphis. There's a certain moral or spiritual imperative to why he decides this. He thinks they have to carry on Meredith's march to defy this culture of fear. But he also, it's rooted in his spiritual background. The day that Meredith launched his march, he had delivered a sermon at Ebenezer Baptist Church, his home church in Atlanta, called Guidelines for a Constructive Church, in which he talked about the role of the minister. And he said the minister's role is not to entertain, it's not to make people happy with themselves, but rather to affect social change, to be a voice for the poor. And he saw this so that was an important aspect of why he had to begin this march. But he also saw a political opportunity, a chance to replicate the triumphs of Birmingham and Selma, where there'd been nonviolent action that had brought about racist violence, which in turn helped to stimulate a national conscience through the media, and ultimately helped lead to federal legislation. So King is at the political center as much as he's at the narrative center of this story. When the march began, there were these late-night meetings at the Lorraine Motel right here in Memphis, where basically every important figure in the civil rights movement would be congregating in the room of Martin Luther King. And he's in a lot of ways the balance in the room, because there are groups like the NAACP and the Urban League that are well-funded and hierarchical and legal in nature. And then there's more militant grassroots groups like SNCC and also the Congress of Racial Equality, CORE. And King sort of is in between with his group, SCLC. And it's King who gives these meetings some ballast. It's through King that he insists that the march remain nonviolent, and that becomes sort of a public aspect of the march, and that it also remain open to white participation, which some of the militants are arguing against. But when Stokely Carmichael at these late-night meetings attacks Roy Wilkins of the NAACP and Whitney Young of the Urban League, just simply insults them and makes him, and very purposely tries to make him seem impossible to work with so that it works. And the NAACP and the Urban League declined to be officially involved in this march, and Wilkins and Whitney Young are gone. That leaves Martin Luther King as the voice of moderation on this march, balancing the radicals. So King is often thus at the moral center of this march as well. He's someone who can acknowledge the sources and the potential benefits of black power. Just to give you one quote of his, he says, "You can always tell where the Negro community begins because that's where the pavement ends. We're going to change that when we get the ballot. That's what we mean when we say power." So he's trying to channel black power into the sort of a larger liberal political tradition. But he never uses the phrase itself. He never chants black power, because it is an implicit criticism of two of his core values, that of nonviolence and that of integration. Here's King speaking to a group of marchers at Enid Dam, federal property, in the first week of the march. Later in the march, he's in Yazoo City. It's after the slogan of Black Power hasn't been unveiled. This is toward the end of their time in the Delta. And this rally has turned into a big public debate over black power to a certain degree. Some of the militants who spoke at this rally were getting huge cheers. People like Willie Ricks, who was part of SNCC, and Ernest Thomas, who was the leader of an organization called the Deacons for Defense and Justice, which was basically an armed self-defense organization. They were patrolling the march alongside Mississippi State Highway Patrol, and they were the ones who were protecting the marchers in their tents. And they weren't looking to attack people, but if the marchers were attacked, they were the ones who were going to shoot back. Ernest Thomas said, quote, "We do not intend for any redneck to abuse any black people anymore. If they do, there'll be a blood red Mississippi. Just don't mess with this march." This is very different from the love thy brother nonviolent rhetoric that the country had, that the larger nation had become sort of comfortable and familiar with and associating with the civil rights movement through Martin Luther King. Anyway, there are many speakers at this rally in Yazoo City, and King was the last speaker, as he very often was. And as he walked to the stage, just to give you some indication of how central he was to the march, because it was King who not only brought the media to the march, but also brought people to the march. People just wanted to touch it. And when he came to this rally in Yazoo City, he was wading through the crowd. People are grasping his hand. They just wanted to touch him. They just wanted to hold him. They'd heard so much about him, and this was a chance to really connect with this almost like a messiah figure. When he was speaking, many SNCC workers had become disillusioned with King's rhetoric by this time, and one of the SNCC workers mocked and yelled, "Blessed Jesus," when King was talking, and some of the older people in the crowd locals from Yazoo City turned around and nodded. They're like, yep. So when King spoke, he said, look, realistically, black people are not a majority in this country. We can't go it alone. We need a, quote, what he calls a coalition of conscience. But he also appealed to emotion, and he talked about death. This was very important. He said, now, I'm not afraid of death. When I die, I'm going to die for something. And at that moment, I guess it'll be necessary. But I'm trying to say something to you, my friends, that I hope we will all gain tonight. And that is that we have a power. We can't win violently, but we have another method, and I've seen it, and they can't stop it. And from there, he talks about Birmingham. And from there, he talked about Selma. And he talked about how nonviolence was the most effective means to win the American ideals of democracy and freedom, that they needed to convert the conscience of the nation for them to actually get what they need. So he's trying to hold on to the march, the meaning of the march, right? And he's got this very slippery grasp that he'll barely be able to maintain throughout the end of the march. So I guess King too has his march. This was the speech that I referenced was on June 21st. And remember, he said, now I'm not afraid of death. In fact, that very day, he had been afraid of death. That day, the marchers had taken a side trip to Philadelphia, Mississippi, in Neshoba County. It was the exact second anniversary of the murders of James Chaney, Andrew Goodman, and Michael Schwerner, famous murder of 3 civil rights workers just at the dawn of Freedom Summer. So they decided they were going to organize this demonstration, the second anniversary remembrance of this march, by working with local black leaders there, and they were going to lead a march from what was called Independence Quarters, which is the black district in Philadelphia, Mississippi. They were going to march to the courthouse and lead a voter registration drive. But because they weren't on the official march route, they had very scanty protection from the Mississippi State Highway Patrol, from the official state police, which meant that they were protected by the local police. Well, the local police included Cecil Price and James Rainey, these 2 men here, men who were at that point under federal investigation for the murders of Chaney, Goodman, and Schwerner. Turned out to be affiliated with the Klan and directly involved in this in those murders. So basically, they got virtually no protection. So as they started this protest walk, cars would buzz within inches of some of the marchers. The streets were packed with hostile whites who were in windows and on the sidewalks, screaming insults at them. When they tried to lead a memorial service, cars were honking. One man attacked a television cameraman, just beat the crap out of him. When they finally amassed at the courthouse to give their speeches, there was a real palpable sense of danger. One of the activists I talked to, he remembered that he was scanning the crowd looking for snipers. And his friend, his fellow organizer, I interviewed him as well, and he said he could remember his friend, the way the hairs were standing on the back of his neck, he was so scared. Martin Luther King, in fact, said that he'd never been so scared in his whole life as he was in Philadelphia, Mississippi at that point. And very famously, in the midst of this march, he said, 3 men were killed here, and quote, I believe in my heart that the murderers are somewhere around me at this moment. Someone in the crowd yelled, they're right behind you. And that included Cecil Price, one of the deputy sheriff over there, who simply smirked. He was one of the murderers. And as they marched out back to Independence Quarters, they were attacked pretty brutally. Eggs were thrown at them, rocks were thrown at them. People waded into the crowd with sticks and axe handles and all sorts of weapons, attacking the black marchers. At one point, an all-out brawl developed between some of the black marchers and some of the white locals. It could have turned into a massacre. Luckily, they got back to the safety of the black district just in time. That violence led to pleas that the federal government get involved in the march, that they help protect the march. Now, the U.S. Marshals had helped to protect the march from Selma to Montgomery the year before. But that time, there was a federal court order that had preceded that. There wasn't anything like that with the Meredith March. And moreover, President Lyndon Johnson was increasingly alienated from the civil rights movement in the year between Selma and the Meredith March. He had left the protection to the Mississippi State Highway Patrol. And for most of the march, the Mississippi State Highway Patrol did an adequate job of protecting them, because under Governor Paul Johnson, they didn't want more violence, right? More violence would mean more crises and would lead to more intervention, especially early in the march. If there was another attack on a marcher, that would be trouble for them. It's trouble for the state of Mississippi. So their strategy was protect them, let them register a few voters, keep them moving, and then let's get the national media and these civil rights outside agitators out of Mississippi, and we can go back to the status quo. That was their strategy. Then violence in Philadelphia occurred, but still, Johnson declined to increase the presence of Justice Department officials or to send U.S. Marshals, and basically tried to avoid speaking of the march one way or the other. There were, King and Carmichael and others were sending telegrams to Johnson pleading for federal protection. He refused to give it. What had happened in the intervening year, since Johnson had shepherded through the Voting Rights Act, since he delivered soaring rhetorical action in which he talked about how the next stage in civil rights had to come, and it had to tackle issues of class. But since then, there'd been a destructive riot in South Central Los Angeles, the Watts riot, in which Johnson somehow took personally, as if this was a betrayal of him and all he'd done for civil rights. There was a large controversy over the so-called Moynihan Report, which blamed many of the class and economic issues that plagued African Americans on black family structure, and many black activists objected to this. And there was also increasing criticism of his escalation of the war in Vietnam. Meanwhile, on the march, the groups he's most used to working with, the NAACP and the Urban League, have declined to be part of the march. And Carmichael and other militants are openly blasting LBJ. So he gets no political benefit from the march, and he thus ignores it. He refuses to increase protection for it. But what that means is that as the march is winding down, as we get into the last week, the state of Mississippi basically has carte blanche for however they want to treat the marchers. So if they want to respond with violence, they know the federal government is not going to respond. On the morning of June 23rd, 2 days after the Philadelphia attack, again, the tent crew, which arrived in advance of the marchers, tried to put up the tents at a black school in Canton, Mississippi. They were arrested, as they'd been in Greenwood. But remember that in Greenwood, the marcher strategy was, okay, if you're going to arrest our advance crew, we're still going to go and we're going to occupy another piece of land. What are you going to do, arrest 1,000 people? So this is their strategy. On the way in, they stop and have another rally at the courthouse. This is the Canton Courthouse, Madison County Courthouse in Canton. And Carmichael is the one who speaks last this time. He says, they said we couldn't pitch our tents on our black school. Well, we're going to do it now. They snake through the black district, more than 1,000 marchers. They pick up more people, and they show up at the school called McNeil Elementary School. And they walk onto the ball field, and they're surprised. There's virtually no police presence there. They think it's a triumph, just like they'd had at Greenwood when they were able to seize this piece of public land. And they always want the piece of public land because they say, look, black people pay taxes. We're citizens of the United States. We deserve to use the land in the black community. So the tents start to go up, and there's a mood of jubilation. And then dozens of highway patrol cars show up. They assemble into a column, and they don their riot gear. Martin Luther King is on top of a truck. He's urging the crowd, stay ordered, stay unified. Meanwhile, Carmichael is staking around the people saying, pitch the tents, pitch the tents. He's ready for the confrontation, and it happens. It's just getting dark, it's about 8 o'clock by this time, and the police launch tear gas. Now, they don't launch tear gas for crowd control. Police can use tear gas to just simply scatter people if they launch it along the line. They're using tear gas to punish the Meredith marchers. They're not creating exit paths, but they're shooting it right into the crowd. People are getting hit with tear gas canisters. The leaders of the highway patrol are specifically directing people to attack particular pockets of people. Some marchers hide under the tent, which could collapse. They shoot tear gas into the tent. And then the police move in on those who had dropped to the ground to let the tear gas rise. And they hit them with nightsticks. They kick them. They drag them into ditches. It's a mood of just chaos. Half-blinded people in every direction. There's a chain link fence that a lot of people tried to climb over, and it simply topples under their weight. People screaming, crying, vomiting, squirming, wailing, gasping for breath. Toward the end, as the field is finally clearing, as the smoke is clearing, the police gather the tents and they impound the truck. There's a dazed woman who walks toward the police officers, and she says, "Can't you see I'm a human being just like you? Can't you see it?" And the policeman drawls back, "I couldn't see it. I couldn't see it." The Canton attack reveals a whole host of reactions. The governor of Mississippi, Paul Johnson, gives perhaps the most disingenuous response he could give, that it had to happen. Moreover, that no one was hurt, and that he called it, quote, the humane thing to do. The larger American public was outraged, but just briefly. This happened late at night, so it didn't make the evening news that night. It happened in the dark, so there were very few sort of iconic images on par with Birmingham and Selma. Probably most important of all was that the federal government continued to ignore it, that they didn't translate this into a political issue. It was basically ignored by Lyndon Johnson, it was basically ignored by the Justice Department, besides the very brave and courageous officials who were actually on the march. They're trying to avoid any late federal intervention into this march. They just kind of want it to end. For Martin Luther King, he says, look, an attack like this reinforces the need for nonviolence. How can we remain violent in the face of a force like that, he says? Or how can we be violent in the face of a force like that? But for militants, for people like Carmichael, this solidifies their attitudes about the permanence, about the harshness of white racism against black people, of a racist system. Carmichael himself had been hit by a tear gas canister in the midst of this, and he had a moment of just pure panic. This is a guy who was in his mid-20s at the time, and was just under enormous pressure. He'd been catapulted into national prominence, and he was dealing with sort of the new swelling mood of the movement. And for a moment, I think it just broke him for a second. But when he recovered, he's even more confrontational, more militant than he'd been before. In the final days of the march, the activists returned to two of their key battlegrounds. They did lead a defiant second march through Philadelphia, this time with very good protection from the Mississippi Highway Patrol, just to prove that, again, they could defy this culture of fear in Neshoba County, Mississippi. Ironically, it was the same, and this was the morning after the tear gas attack. The same officers who had attacked them with tear gas in Canton, Mississippi, were protecting them in Philadelphia on their second march. They also decided that they were going to return to McNeil Elementary. They had to, again, defy this culture of fear, right? So they decided they were going to return to the ball field in Canton the next night. But it turned out to be anticlimactic, because what local leaders had done was they negotiated a compromise in which they agreed to bargain with white officials for the future, and also to avoid a bloodbath, another tear gas attack, because they had their concern for the local people. So instead of pitching the tents there for a second night, they agreed to hold a rally, and the tents had moved on to the next stop. But that very much disillusioned a lot of the militants on the march. They were very frustrated with that development. The march moved on to Jackson, where we were supposed to finish. The last stop before the end was Rhodes College, just on the northern edge of Hinds County. And there was a late night rally that included Sammy Davis Jr., James Brown, appearances by celebrities like Dick Gregory and Marlon Brando, Burt Lancaster. And then on the last day of the march, Sunday, June 26th, an estimated 15,000 people joined the last leg of the march into downtown Jackson. They ended up holding a rally at the state capitol. What had begun as the endeavor of a single quirky icon, James Meredith, ended in the largest demonstration, the largest civil rights demonstration in Mississippi history. This was the last great march of the civil rights movement. It was the last time major organizations would cooperate together on a mass nonviolent demonstration, one that would become national news and become a political lobbying tool on a federal level. Moreover, generated a huge controversy over black power. It had helped to further alienate Lyndon Johnson from the civil rights movement. This era of transformative legislation came to an end. For people like Roy Wilkins and other liberals, they saw black power as an enemy. Wilkins famously said in the aftermath of the march that black power was, quote, a reverse Mississippi, or a reverse Hitler, or a reverse Ku Klux Klan. Many liberals echoed him. And yet black power took on many forms. Electoral politics, cultural pride, black arts, black power's salute, that was famously displayed at the 1968 Olympics. And it shaped how black people organized in a political realm, and it helped to elect black mayors in places like Gary, and places like Cleveland, and places like Atlanta, ultimately places like Memphis. Stokely Carmichael, in the aftermath of the march, would basically be deemed the heir to Malcolm X, a hero to black militants, a bullseye for an emerging white backlash against the movement. For Martin Luther King, he was particularly shaped by the Meredith March. From there, he was back to Chicago, and for all the fear that he faced in Chicago, he said he faced the same level of fear in Marquette Park in Chicago, and what would end up being a very ambiguous campaign over the summer of 1966 there. And for King, it would reinforce that race was not simply a Southern problem, but a national problem. But he was particularly influenced by the poverty in Mississippi. He had hoped that this march would highlight the deep poverty in Mississippi and urge the federal government to do something about it. And he was never able to get the media on his side. He was never able to translate that message. And that helped to shape the endeavor that he hoped to promote in 1968, the so-called Poor People's Campaign. And that brought him back to Mississippi a number of times, and to some of the spots in which he'd been on the march. And also that was the same endeavor that brought him back to Memphis in 1968 for the sanitation strike. So where they had 2 years earlier launched these chaotic meetings and these impassioned meetings in King's hotel room at the Lorraine Motel, 2 years later, of course, that's where King meets his demise. As for James Meredith, he walks on. The year after the march in 1967, given his independent frame of mind, he decided that he was going to walk the stretch of Highway 51 that he had missed, from where he'd been shot in Hernando to where he rejoined the march in Canton. Even though that wasn't the route that the main marchers took through the Delta, he said, I'm going to finish what I started. But there were no shootings and no controversies on that march, and it failed to garner much attention, but it did speak to Meredith's frame of mind. And Meredith continues to launch these walks. He walks in Mississippi, he walked in New York, once he walked from Evanston, Illinois, all the way to the East Coast. And he always does it to sort of to promote a cause, sometimes voter registration, more recently education and literacy. And he remains an incredibly unpredictable man, so fundamentally conservative in a lot of ways. At various times, He did have a political career. Sometimes he ran as a Republican, other times as a Democrat, other times as an independent. In the 80s and 90s, he took this turn toward far-right conservatism. He briefly worked for Jesse Helms, the senator from North Carolina, and even endorsed at one point the campaign of David Duke, a former Klansman who was running for office in Louisiana. He's a man who continues to march to the beat of his own drummer. But I think that if you're going to really assess the impact of the Meredith March, you have to shift away from the headliners to some degree and look at the local people. Look at the people in Mississippi. Remember that over 4,000 people registered to vote in Mississippi over the course of these 3 weeks. There were rallies all along the route to try to promote voter registration. Most dramatically, perhaps, was at the first one in Batesville, Mississippi. There was a man named L. Fondren, this man here, who registered to vote for the first time in his life. He was 106 years old. He'd been born a slave. And again, just as James Meredith had intended, people were defying the culture of fear. There are many stories throughout the march of glaring whites, certain that their communities, black people, weren't interested in voting rights, didn't want to associate with these outside agitators. And yet, those people would get up, they would walk alongside the marchers, they would cheer the marchers on, they would go and register to vote. They were defeating aspects of white supremacy just by their actions. And when you look at this march from the perspective of the marchers themselves, you see a lot more unity than the press is willing to give them credit for. They shared a common purpose, after all. This was a mass demonstration that was supposed to expose the depth of black grievances in 1966, and also the height of black possibilities, and it did both of those things. I love this picture, this is my favorite. I'll tell you about maybe my favorite interview as well, just to end. As I mentioned, I interviewed about 100 people for the book. One really stuck out for me. It was a woman named Elsie Dorsey. She's since passed away. After the march, she was an activist, especially with anti-poverty work in Jackson, Mississippi. She later became a professor of social work at Jackson State University, and a writer, and a very good writer. And this is the story I used to actually end the last chapter. It's one that, to me, captures the march's impact in kind of personal terms and cultural terms, maybe even spiritual terms. I sat in her kitchen, and she gave me a cup of coffee, and she told me about growing up on a plantation in the Delta, and about how she got involved in the movement, and about moving to Jackson when that plantation mechanized and she lost her job. She had a lot of kids, I think 6 kids. But she decided when she was going to walk on that final day that she wasn't going to bring her kids because she remembered what had happened in Philadelphia and Canyon, and she feared, in her own words, that it was going to be a bloodbath. But as she was walking, she regretted not bringing the kids. It was like a spiritual awakening, she said. There was an energy that I have not felt before or since. She was still afraid. She was still afraid that white people were going to attack them. But she loved the spirit there. It reminded her of when she first got involved in the civil rights movement, when she attended a mass meeting in a small church or in a Mason hall. And when they started singing freedom songs, she swore that she could hear the individual voices of some of her fellow freedom fighters, people like Hollis Watkins and June Johnson. She had sort of that poetic frame of mind, people who were in this longer struggle for freedom. And then she talked about how they got to the state capitol for the last rally. And the singing stopped. And all of a sudden you could just hear the crunch, 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 crunch of all their footsteps. And then the marching stopped. And it got really quiet. She said, as if even the birds had stopped flying. And there was something perfect about that moment of beautiful silence. Thank you. I'd be happy to answer any questions if we have time. Ma'am?
Talk about the name of the book.
So, and there's a chapter in the middle of the book, actually, where the Black Power slogan is unveiled, called also Down at the Crossroads. And of course, the Crossroads are a very important sort of Mississippi history, and particularly in blues history, right? Robert Johnson supposedly sells his soul to play the guitar at the crossroads to the death, right? And at crossroads, in the Delta, there are crossroads everywhere, and they're very important landmarks in the Mississippi Delta because, it's flat land and there's just long roads, right? But a crossroads also has a symbolic quality to it. It is, what the choice you make has an enduring consequence. So the beginning of Black Power is a crossroads in the civil rights movement. Down, I didn't mean it in a negative sense, but more that they're marching south. Other questions? Yes, sir.
Regarding the violent part of the movement, I'm wondering if you came across the name H. Rap Brown, and I'm wondering if you did come across that name, how do you think he may or may not have impacted the Black Power movement?
Well, H. Rap Brown was Carmichael's successor, of course, as the chairman of SNCC. and in many ways reflected both how SNCC was becoming even more radical and was using this provocative rhetoric and was drifting more in Maryland politics, but also helped to drive out, in fact, many people of Carmichael's generation, right? Including Carmichael, including Cleveland Sellers, who was these were people associated with the Black Power movement, right? So H.R. Brown, as far as I know, he was not on the Meredith March. I could be wrong about that, but I didn't come across his name on it. But he, in some ways, signaled where SNCC went from here, and it ultimately fell apart, of course. SNCC fell apart pretty quickly in the aftermath of the march. As Carmichael put it, yeah, SNCC worked for Black Power, and Black Power killed SNCC. Because and not that, and this is a guy who, to the end of his days, of course, would celebrate Black Power, but he recognized that the organization could no longer hold based on the many different viewpoints within.
Aram, thanks for a great presentation.
Thanks.
As you mentioned, this is a familiar event for historians
Uh-huh.
in the civil rights movement in America more generally, but
Mhm.
how did doing this research and writing this book change your thinking about the civil rights movement or about bigger themes in the movement like Black Power and nonviolence?
I think it goes back to what I tried to say at the beginning about how I tried to take everyone on their own terms, right? That I tried to tell a story that would allow you to see the different perspectives within the movement, both how they would work against each other, but also how they could work in concert. So this march was kind of like a laboratory for black politics, sort of, right? And it just kept moving. So to me, that was the appeal of trying to tell this story, but it also was the developing intellectual aspect of it as I went along, because with every sort of new set of sources that I could mine, and particularly the interviews, right? The interviews helped me to try to think about it as not just a political story, but a human story. And made me think about the civil rights movement more in the terms that a lot of local stories, like people like Professor McKinney do, right? That they think of the civil rights movement not necessarily through the national framework, but more through what does it mean for people, right? What does it mean for actual people? So it helped me, talking to people who are involved in the march, it helped me to think about that way. So that was the part that probably developed the most over time. Wrestling with Black Power was, of course, a great challenge, right? Because on the one hand, you had to acknowledge it's the ways that it could drive apart these groups that had worked there. And it's not that the ideas for Black Power weren't there, and they would have come out without the Meredith March. It's not like this march changed what would have happened, but what it did was it dramatized those events and it accelerated those events, right? So wrestling with Black Power was interesting for that, because on the one hand I had to acknowledge that, but on the other hand you had to see its uplifting aspects, and that again comes from talking to people, right? When I talked to a woman who was 16 years old at the time from Kosciuszko, Mississippi, who marched, she said it just gave me a sense of who I was, and I love that quote because Black Power gave her a sense of who she was. That give you the human dimensions of what it could mean. Sure.
What do you feel the enduring legacy of this period is in 2014? Me and an associate was speaking just this week, and we kind of half jokingly, but half seriously, weighing whether Mississippi was still the most backward state in the union, or whether Florida, so, how do you feel about the legacy of what transpired then and how it still relates to what exists today in Mississippi, which obviously is nowhere close to a progressive state, in some ways it's extremely regressive.
Well, I think in Mississippi, perhaps, and again, I'm speculating to a degree here. I'm no expert on contemporary Mississippi. I'm not a native Mississippian. I think I know more or less what we know as a group, right, in terms of the contemporary political scene. But I think what I saw on the march, in terms of, in other places, you see some sort of local white cooperation, perhaps on some level. In Mississippi, even for those who were the progressive newspaper editors of the time, the really courageous newspaper editors who spoke out against lynching in the Klan in the 30s and 40s and talked about adherence to federal law, to like the Brown decision and the Civil Rights Act in the 50s and 60s, they still see this march as agitators and as chaotic and as nothing to do with their sort of agenda of trying to create sort of a more, they want sort of a very orderly transition. They don't see themselves as liberals. There is no real white liberal in Mississippi in any sort of significant way at the time. I'm guessing that continues to have a pretty significant effect on Mississippi politics. So there are of course a whole swath of white liberals now, and I'm not suggesting there weren't any white liberals at the time, but it wasn't a significant political force yet. So I think that division of race mixed with political orientation is obviously a problem in the Deep South states in particular.
It strikes me that there are a lot of similarities between what happened in the March of '66 in Mississippi and what happened in Memphis 2 years later. The same conflicting approaches and so forth with the moderates, the NAACP, and then Jim Lawson in the middle, and then the radicals, and all of the things that happen. It seems, difference in degree, but still similar in many ways.
Just to give a sort of a personal connection back to the march with that, I interviewed Kobe Smith, of course, who was one of the who helped to, of course, integrate this institution, and was attending what was then Southwestern College during the Meredith March. And he had just started a summer job after school, and then Meredith got shot, and he marched almost the entire way. And this was to him, this was, what did he say? This was not just a political experience. He said this was growing up for me. That this was his maturation into manhood. That it gave him the experience of dealing with civil rights activists from around the country, and particularly surrounding himself with other civil rights workers. He got to talk to Martin Luther King and debate nonviolence with him, and he came to really adore and admire Stokely Carmichael. So for him, that was the beginning of his transition into to becoming an invader, right, in 67 and 68, of becoming part of that black organizing project. So that's just to give a human story to the connection that you very rightfully draw. Okay.
As a participant in that march, of course I admire Dr. King with greatest respect, but Stokely was also someone that we could identify with as a young person because, Black Power meant something for us. It meant pride. And so, yes, we raised our fists and said Black Power along with Stokely. And, but Dr. King, he was also the leader. So which one would you say would, I guess, have the most influence when it, when you look at the entire situation? You said it was Stokely's march, it was Martin Luther King's march, it was James Meredith's march. Well, which one do you think had the overriding effect?
Yes. Ladies and gentlemen, this is Elaine Turner. She was on the march. I just met her today, and I said I wish that I'd been able to talk to her too. She'd been a participant in the Meredith March, and the sentiments that you said about Stokely Carmichael, but also the admiration for Martin Luther King, that was echoed by a lot of the people of your generation that I did have the chance to talk to on the march. They said, we like Dr. King and we like to talk to him, and he was willing to talk to us. It wasn't that he was our enemy whatsoever, but they tended to gravitate towards Stokely Carmichael, as I think you alluded to too, that he was speaking your language to a certain degree. I didn't mean to be flippant about your question. I guess I did mean to be flippant, but I guess what I was trying to say is I tried to approach the march and that everybody should have their march, right? And that was what I think I have tried to do that is different from how others have treated it, because others have looked at it through the lens of Black Power, or they've looked at it through the lens of Martin Luther King. And I've tried to, I see three main characters in Meredith, King, and Carmichael, but I also see this as a cast of hundreds and thousands, and they have their own, everyone has their own march. And I think that's what I tried to, the approach I tried to keep bringing into it. James?
You dealt in your book a lot with the role of women in some of the resistance to occupation. Could you speak a little bit to that and how it seemed to me that was the beginning of a lot of movement in that issue as well, because you also in your book talk about later on it really began to change.
Dealing with the issue of women's participation in the Meredith March was in some ways kind of frustrating for me, because I very much acknowledge the centrality of women in the civil rights movement, and particularly when you look at grassroots organizing, and scholars like Charles Payne and John Dittmer, who looked at particularly at Mississippi, and people like Professor McKinney, who talked about North Carolina, they show you the central roles of women, right? The Meredith March, because it's a national demonstration and because the media is there, right, they focus on the civil rights leaders and on the roles of men. So I kept trying to find avenues to talk about the critical central role of women in grassroots organizing. So I spent a little section, for instance, on Fannie Lou Hamer when she speaks at the Enid Dam, to use that as a lens into that. So that is one of the ways in which I tried to consider the roles of women in the march and bring their importance into it, even when many of the sources from the time obscure that. The other way in which we deal with this, in some ways, for some activists, particularly for white female activists, they saw this as this march as sort of the beginnings of their feminist consciousness. In particular, a woman named Jo Freeman, who had become a very influential feminist. She was on the Meredith March. She'd worked for SCLC. And she talked about how on the march they were sort of constantly bombarded with flirtations and sexual aggression. And the women started to discuss this. And it was sort of the beginnings of their sort of gender consciousness to a certain degree, that they saw the civil rights movement had given them a language of equality and a way to think about agitating for equality, and they were starting to apply it to a different realm. for African American women at the time, the ones that I asked this question, they said, still for them, they would argue that primary oppression was race. Mrs. Turner, would you say that? Yeah, they would still argue, even those who would later become feminists in different ways and on their own terms. In this period, in 1966, they still saw race as the primary oppression. They weren't making that connection yet because it wasn't as relevant to their daily struggle. I think is that fair to say, Mr. Turner? Okay. In the back.
Do you think there could have been any impact to the civil rights movement as a whole by going down Highway 51 instead of taking the deviation through the Delta?
I think the deviation to the Delta helped to increase its significance because what they were finding along Route 51 was that there were black communities along that route, but not in the significant. They weren't seeing black majorities in the Delta, as they would see in the Delta, and they wanted sort of if one of the primary aims was voter registration, they knew that they could make a much bigger impact by taking the march into the Delta. It also extended the march, so it made it longer and it created a longer story. And it brought it into some of its most dramatic flashpoints, including, of course, Greenwood and the unveiling of Black Power. Yeah?
Could you talk a little bit about the fear part of the purpose behind the march? Because the courage that it took for people to step out and do that is really meaningful, and I think that it's not that I'd like to hear you talk more about what people said about what they had to overcome and what their lives were like in this.
Well, just to give you the other side of that, I talked to a number of people around the Batesville area, someone put me in connection with, who didn't march. They were all teachers. And teachers were very, had been involved in the civil rights struggle. And these are people who were pointed out to me as community leaders from the time, and they were, and I'm not suggesting they weren't others. But they said, if I went and marched down the street in Mississippi, my job is funded by the state, right? What's the first thing that's going to happen to me? I'm going to lose my job, right? There was a guy in Panola County, where Batesville is, named Stanley Edmond, who had just run for school board that year. He lost his job, was attacked by the Klan. There were bricks thrown through his windows. The radio would casually mention his address consistently, just for funsies, So that gives you some example of the reprisals that, if you were a local activist, that you could face. So imagine that, like if that's just sort of the culture that you live under, right? Just the very act of getting up, right? You're waiting for the marchers to come by, and they're saying, "Come on, join us," right? And you weren't planning on joining because that's perhaps dangerous. Getting up and walking, even if it's just through your town, right? And you say goodbye. That's a audacious political act for the time and for the circumstance. Yeah.
You gestured at the beginning towards the international movement. Just talk about that a little bit.
Sure. When Meredith is shot, it's front page in news, not just in the American newspapers, but it's reported around the country, and it's reported often in very different ways. Like the British papers, pointed in sort of a typical American framework. In the Soviet Union, the press, in general, the communist press uses as an example of America's racial hypocrisies. So there's somewhat of a lobbying tool. Robert F. Kennedy at this time is in South Africa, actually, where he's drawing connections between the apartheid state and what's going on in the United States. And he uses James Meredith as a symbol of how we can overcome this oppression. So that language is there at the beginning. And people for the Black Power activists, they're already talking about sort of the linked struggles. That's sort of a tenet of Black Power, as of course that it's the struggles of oppressed people of color connect not just what's going on in the South, but what's going on in Africa, what's going on in Vietnam, right? And this is shaping their anti-Vietnam agenda as much as anything else.
Can you talk a little bit about the local changes that happened after the march? Did you get an impression of you mentioned some of the people that registered to vote, but any other changes?
It really depends on the community for what happens. Like for instance, in Grenada, Mississippi, there's really no local civil rights movement that predates the march coming. It's been brutally repressive whenever the civic organizers have tried to go into Grenada and they've failed. They haven't been able to get a local participation because people are afraid. When the march comes through, that spearheads mass voter registration. Of the 4,000 people who registered to vote during the time of the march, almost 1,000 of them are from Grenada. And they form their own organization called the Grenada County Movement. And SCLC organizers go back to Grenada afterwards. And actually some of them stayed once the march moved on, and then others went back to try to lead a campaign there over the course of the summer. So it helps to develop this political consciousness in Grenada, and it leads to some aspects of progress. There's school integration in Grenada that fall, but Grenada is also the site of as brutal violence almost as you saw in Canton when school integration begins. A white mob attacks children, including literally attacks children, including there's one story of a girl getting beaten who is she's crippled and she has polio, and they're attacking her because she was one of like the 8 girls who attended the school. There's another story that I tell of this tiny plantation town called Midnight. It's in the middle of it's in the Delta. I think there's about 500 people who live there, and the local whites are watching the march pass through, and they say, our black people would never join this march. They're not interested in civil rights. And at the time, there wasn't any sort of audacious demonstration or so on at midnight. But that march convinced some of the local blacks to start registering to vote, right? So that just gives you, again, a sort of a change in the mindset. But the march is also capturing these different communities at different times. In Greenwood, there had been this huge surge of organization in 62, 63, especially 64 with Freedom Summer, but it had died out after snake organizers essentially left it in 1965 because they were disillusioned with Mississippi. So the march gives them a chance to sort of restore that spirit, but it's a brief rekindling. So it really depends upon the circumstances. In Jackson, where it's more sort of an established NAACP town, the more voters you register, the easier it is to elect black officials and so on. So with each community and each circumstance, it really depends.
Did you talk to anyone from South Mississippi, south of Jackson, to see how it affected them during that time? And do you think things would have been different had the march continued past Jackson for those areas?
That's a good question. To my knowledge, besides maybe activists who were in various projects but who had come, who were stationed around Mississippi who had come for the march, I didn't talk to locals from South Mississippi. There were some proposals that said, hey, let's carry this all the way into Louisiana, but that might have been what sort of looking for. Logistically, very difficult. It would have been a six-week. Already as it was, this was a huge logistical challenge. When they marched from Selma, it was 4 days. They had a week, 10 days to prepare for it. They had a federal court order. They knew they had protection. They knew exactly where they were going to stop and who was going to march in each part. It was entirely improvised in the Meredith March, right? Everybody showed up the day after the shooting. Getting back to your question. The one story I do tell from the south part of Mississippi involves the murder of a man named Ben Chester White. He was murdered outside of Natchez. And he was murdered by 3, it's a chapter where especially are dealing with white reactions to the march and the various white political strategies. And he's murdered by 3 men who were part of a group called the Cottonmouth Moccasin Gang, which is basically an offshoot of the Ku Klux Klan. And they murder this innocent black handyman. They say, hey, come help us, we're searching for a lost dog. And they take him out to the woods and they shoot him and they kill him. Why? They figure that if they do that and it becomes public, then Martin Luther King will come down to Mississippi, will come down to Natchez, and then they'll kill him too. They're arrested and found because they're idiots and they botched it. But that's just to give you something. I use it to sort of illustrate the depth of white supremacists at the time. Yeah.
How would you respond if whites or black Americans say that your book does not speak to the contents of civil rights in 2014? How would you respond to that? I know it's kind of complex.
Sure, that's a big question, and I don't think that I claim to speak to the conscience of 2014, and I don't mean that in any sort of negative sense. I tried to write it as a historian, immersed in the time, trying to tell people's perspectives there. There's no, and when I say that, when people sometimes ask me how I got into, what's my interest in African American history, I say, it wasn't the way that many, in particular, for those who are non-African Americans, sometimes they come at it from an activist frame of mind. I don't in any way fault that. I think that is a wonderful thing, and they have a sort of an activist sense of how they do history. It wasn't the perspective that I brought. I was trying to tell it as a storyteller, right? This is I see myself as a narrative historian who tries to understand people on their own terms and their different perspectives. So if it doesn't speak directly to 2014, it was never my direct intention to do so. But having said that, if people want to take what I've written and apply it to their political perspective, apply it to their fight for social change, of course I would support that. It's not that I'm against it. It's just that it wasn't the historical approach that I brought to it.
I think you've done an excellent job, and that's why I asked that question, because it is relevant.
Thank you. That's very nice of you. Andrew?
Thank you so much for your talk. This was excellent. At the beginning, you said that your book kind of straddles the old civil rights and new civil rights histories. Could you talk a little bit more about kind of the movement back and forth? I mean, certainly the attention to locals and telling this sort of from the ground story, like you mentioned, Dr. McKinney's work does that. But can you talk to us maybe about kind of how you're thinking about both kind of this old way of doing
Sure.
civil rights history and new together, and how those are intersecting in your work?
One thing I tried to emphasize was how the politics of a local community is having national ramifications, right? So, for instance, when they get to Grenada and they challenge the white order there, there's, like in every town in Mississippi, there's a memorial to the Confederacy there, and the marchers stick an American flag on this monument, and one of the speakers refers to Jefferson Davis as that joker up there, and that leads to, I'm going to talk about this at the Civil Rights Conference at the end of the month. And when that happens, the whites around there are glaring, and they refer to this as the desecration of their monument. And so it could have led into a real sort of big conflict. But Grenada City leaders were following that accommodation strategy of Paul Johnson. They were saying, let them register to vote, let them move on. So that's why there's part of the reason why there were so many registered voters in Grenada, because they said, okay, we'll help you register voters, then just get out of here, right? So that shapes the marching movement. In Greenwood, when the marchers occupy Broad Street Park and the police let it happen, right? That has a direct impact on how Black Power is unveiled, right? If the police had attacked there as they'd done in Canton, we'd be telling a different story about the Meredith March, and it would be a different narrative in terms of national civil rights politics. In Canton, right, it's obviously a very different narrative. So the politics of local communities are shaping what becomes the national story. So that's one way in which I tried to get at that dimension. Okay.
When Meredith was in the hospital here in Memphis, was there a press blackout? Did people know he was here? Was he under police protection?
He was under police protection. At one point, there was a bomb threat at the hospital. He was at Bowles Hospital, which is where the Med is now. It was it was a huge national story. The press descended upon. In fact, there was a whole story about Meredith getting kicked out of the hospital. Essentially, he was there for a night, and then the attending doctor in the morning said, you should really stay for another day. That was like at 7 in the morning, and he said, okay. And then that morning, Martin Luther King and Floyd McKissick, who was the head of CORE, and A.W. Willis, a local attorney here from Memphis, they came to his room right around 11 o'clock in the morning, and the doctor said, okay, here are your discharge papers. He said, what? You told me I was going to stay for the day. And probably what had happened in the interim was that they got sick of this big, press to do around them. In fact, they had taken a lobby in that hotel and turned it into a press room. And these are, the doctors and nurses were frustrated. They said, Meredith's fine, let's get him out of here. So it was a big story. And when he got so-called evicted from the hospital, that led to that day in Memphis. That night there was a rally at Metropolitan Baptist Church, and they ended up launching a silent march through the streets of Memphis to the church, and from the church to the hospital and back. So it was sort of classic Memphis politics. I use an example to show the way that leaders in Memphis had this sort of voice that Black leaders in Mississippi did not. Right, they were able to negotiate with the police, make sure they were getting good protection. Everyone was sort of happy, right? The police were like, it was peaceful and orderly and nothing happened, and the marchers got to demonstrate. So it was sort of that top-down politics in Memphis that we'll later see in '68, as you alluded to, those tensions bubble to the surface, but not in '66. Last question, or go ahead.
Okay, thank you all so much. I know there are probably more questions for Professor Goudsouzian, but luckily he's not going to run out the door at the end of this. In fact, he has books available out front. I want to thank you all so much, and thank Professor McKinney for that wonderful welcome. Remember, in 2 weeks, if you haven't had enough Aram Goudsouzian, be back on campus as part of our From Civil War to Civil Rights conference. You can find out more about that conference as well as other communities and conversation events, Memphis Center stuff. Thank you all so much for coming, and please join us outside for more conversation. Thank you.